I came home from church to find my son and his wife had moved their furniture into my bedroom, my bed pushed out into the hallway like garbage, my dresser replaced with theirs while I was at church, praying for patience with the very people who were busy taking my room out from under me. I set my purse down on the kitchen counter, opened the folder inside it, and walked upstairs. I had been carrying that folder for 6 weeks, waiting to see exactly how far they would go. Now I knew. I am 60 years old, and I have learned that the people who love you least are often the ones who are most confident you will never actually stop them. My name is Evelyn Sorensen. I have lived in my house, a solid, unassuming 2-story brick home on Aldergate Lane, in a quiet neighborhood outside Louisville, Kentucky, for 31 years, ever since my late husband, Marvin. And I purchased it together back when our son Nolan was still small enough to ride on my hip through the empty rooms while we planned where everything would go. Marvin passed away 7 years ago. A slow decline from congestive heart failure that gave us both, at least, the mercy of time to say everything that needed saying before he was gone. Since then, I have lived in that house alone, faithfully attending Sunday services at Grace Fellowship Church, keeping close to a small circle of longtime friends, and maintaining, as best I could, the particular rhythms of a life built for two that had suddenly, permanently, become a life for one. Nolan is 34, married 6 years now to a woman named Brianna. For most of their relationship, my feelings toward Brianna were complicated in a way I struggled to fully articulate even to myself. Not dislike, exactly, but a persistent, low-grade wariness that I often chastised myself for, telling myself repeatedly that a mother's instinct toward caution regarding her son's wife is common enough to be almost a cliché. Not something to take too seriously. The arrangement that led to this story began 8 months ago, when Nolan and Brianna's rental lease ended unexpectedly after their landlord decided to sell the property. And facing a tight rental market and a gap of several weeks before their new apartment would be ready, they asked if they could stay with me temporarily. I agreed without hesitation, the same way I imagine most mothers would. Setting them up in my guest bedroom on the ground floor, a comfortable space with its own adjoining bathroom that I had, in fact, specifically years earlier with exactly this kind of situation in mind. I want to walk through the specific timeline of what happened over those 8 months, because I think the pacing matters enormously for understanding both what I eventually did and why it took me as long as it did to fully act on instincts I had, in truth, been quietly gathering evidence for since almost the very beginning. The new apartment they'd been waiting for fell through in the 3rd week. A financing complication on the building's end, they explained, nothing to do with them directly. Simply an unfortunate delay that would push their move-in date back just a few more weeks. I extended my hospitality without complaint. Weeks became a month, then 2, then 3. Each extension accompanied by some new complication that always sounded, on its own, entirely plausible, entirely outside anyone's control. Around the 2-month mark, I began noticing small shifts in how Brianna, in particular, seemed to relate to my house. Not overt confrontations, nothing I could easily point to as a clear violation, but a slow, steady expansion of her presence and preferences into spaces that had until then remained clearly mine. She began, without asking, replacing certain items in the kitchen with ones she preferred: a coffee maker, a set of mixing bowls, small things that felt individually too minor to comment on, but that accumulated over weeks into a household that increasingly reflected her taste, rather than the home Marvin and I had built together over 3 decades. By the 4-month mark, Brianna had begun referring to specific rooms in ways that unsettled me more than I initially let myself acknowledge. The good bathroom, meaning the one attached to my own bedroom, which she had started using regularly, despite having a perfectly functional bathroom attached to their own guest room, became a phrase she used casually, as though its designation as good somehow implied a shared claim to it. She began leaving her own toiletries in my bathroom, her own towels on my rack, small territorial expansions that I found myself quietly reversing each evening, moving her things back to the guest bathroom, without ever directly confronting what was happening. I want to be honest about why I didn't confront this more directly, sooner, because I think the answer matters for understanding the full shape of this story. He, I loved having Nolan close again, in a way that surprised me with its intensity given how many years had passed since he'd lived under my roof as anything other than an occasional weekend visitor, and some part of me, the same part that had spent 30 years quietly accommodating whatever needed accommodating in service of keeping peace within my family, kept telling myself that these small territorial expansions were not worth the discomfort of confrontation, that they would naturally resolve themselves once Nolan and Brianna finally found their own permanent housing. It was around the 5-month mark that I began, quietly and without telling anyone, including Nolan, to prepare what would eventually become the folder that sat in my purse on the morning this story reaches its turning point. I had out a conversation one ordinary Tuesday afternoon with my longtime friend Patrice, a woman I'd known since our children were in elementary school together, someone whose own difficult experience with an adult child's prolonged, presumptuous house-sharing situation several years earlier had left her. I discovered during that conversation considerably more clear-eyed about warning signs than I had allowed myself to be. "Evelyn," she said. Once I'd described the coffee maker, the mixing bowls, the towels in my bathroom, "I need you to hear something, and I need you to actually sit with it rather than immediately explaining it away, the way I can already tell you're preparing to do. This isn't about a coffee maker. This is about someone slowly testing how much of your home she can claim before you say something, and every week you don't say something, she's learning that the answer is quite a lot." I did not want to believe this, not fully, not yet, but I respected Patrice enough to take her warning seriously, and so, rather than confronting the situation directly, which some cautious, still hopeful part of me continued to believe might resolve on its own, I instead did something quieter and more deliberate. I called my attorney, a careful, thorough man named Foster Kimbrough, who had handled Marvin's and my estate matters for over a decade, and asked him to help me prepare documentation that would allow me, if the situation ever required it, to formally and unambiguously assert my ownership and, if necessary, require Nolan and Brianna to vacate my house on clear legal terms. Foster prepared over the following 2 weeks a folder, the same folder as it happens, that would eventually sit in my purse on a Sunday morning 6 weeks later, containing a copy of my clear property deed, a formal 30-day notice to vacate ready to be dated and served at any point I chose to activate it, and a detailed letter outlining, clearly and unemotionally, the terms under which continued residence in my home would be permitted going forward, should I decide such terms were necessary. I did not activate any of it in those first weeks after receiving the folder. I simply carried it in my purse everywhere I went, a quiet insurance policy against a situation I sincerely hoped would not require it, but that some steady, clear-eyed part of me understood, with growing certainty, probably would. Over the following 6 weeks, the pattern I had begun noticing at the 4- and 5-month marks continued to develop, and I want to walk through several specific incidents during this period, because I think they matter for understanding exactly why. By the time the bedroom incident finally occurred, I was neither surprised nor unprepared. The first significant incident happened roughly a week after I'd received the folder from Foster, when I came home from a hair appointment to find that Brianna had rearranged my entire living room, not simply straightened cushions or moved a side table, but a comprehensive reorganization that had relocated several pieces of furniture Marvin and I had chosen together decades earlier into the garage, replacing them with pieces she and Nolan had apparently been keeping in storage since their old apartment. "I hope that's okay," she said, when I walked in and stood in the doorway, taking in the unfamiliar arrangement of my own living room. "I just felt like the space could use some fresh energy, you know. Your old stuff is nice, don't get me wrong, but it felt a little dated, and I thought this could be like a nice refresh for everyone." I remember standing there, absorbing both the specific violation of having my own furniture removed without consultation and the strange, breezy confidence with which Brianna delivered this explanation, as though rearranging another person's home without permission was simply a thoughtful gift rather than a significant overstep. "Brianna," I said carefully, "I'd appreciate you asking me before making changes like this in the future. This is still my house." "Oh, totally, of course," she said, in a tone that suggested genuine agreement, but that I noticed, even then, was not accompanied by any actual change in behaviour going forward. The second significant incident occurred about 3 weeks later, when I discovered that Brianna had begun receiving mail at my address. Not simply the occasional package, which would have been reasonable enough given her temporary residence, but formal mail, including what appeared to be a bank statement and, more unsettlingly, a piece of correspondence from a moving company that, upon closer inspection, I felt genuinely uncomfortable admitting to myself I'd conducted. Appeared to be a quote for moving larger furniture items, dated for a time roughly 2 months in the future. I did not confront her about this discovery immediately, choosing instead to quietly note it as another piece of evidence in a pattern that was becoming, with each passing week, increasingly difficult to interpret charitably. I mentioned it to Foster during a brief check-in call, and he suggested, gently, that I consider whether it might be time to have a direct conversation with Nolan about a firm, concrete timeline for their departure, rather than continuing to allow the arrangement to drift without clear boundaries. I did have that conversation, roughly a month before the bedroom incident, sitting Nolan down alone, without Brianna present, and asking directly what their actual plan was for finding permanent housing. "Mom, we're working on it," he said, though something in his tone suggested a defensiveness that surprised me, given how reasonable I believed the question to be. "It's a tough market right now, you know that. We're not trying to take advantage of you or anything, if that's what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything, Nolan. I'm asking for a timeline. It's been 5 months. I love having you here, but this was always meant to be temporary. And I need to understand what temporary actually means at this point. Can we talk about this later? I don't really want to get into a whole thing about it right now." I let the conversation drop that evening, though I noted, with the same quiet, gathering clarity I'd been accumulating for weeks, that Nolan's reluctance to establish a firm timeline felt itself like a significant piece of information about how this arrangement had come to be understood on his and Brianna's end. The final piece of evidence, gathered just 4 days before the bedroom incident that finally forced everything into the open, came when I overheard a phone conversation Brianna was having with her mother, conducted, apparently, from what she believed was an empty kitchen while I was actually upstairs, close enough to the vent connecting our floors to hear most of what was being said. "Honestly, it's just easier this way," Brianna was saying, her voice carrying the particular casual confidence of someone who believed she was speaking entirely privately. "Evelyn's alone in this huge house anyway, it's not like she's using all the space. I keep telling Nolan. We just need to sort of settle in properly, stop treating it like it's temporary, and honestly, I think eventually she'll come around to us just staying long term. It's not like she's going to actually kick out her own son, right? Worst case, we save a ton on rent for another year or 2 while we get our finances together. And best case, honestly, I think eventually this just becomes our house. She's not getting any younger, and I don't see her wanting to deal with maintaining a whole house by herself forever." I sat at the top of the stairs, absorbing that conversation in full, feeling something inside me settle into a final, complete clarity that 6 weeks of gathering smaller pieces of evidence had been building toward without my fully realizing it. This was not a temporary arrangement drifting due to unfortunate circumstance. This was, in Brianna's own words, spoken to her mother in a moment of unguarded honesty, a deliberate, calculated strategy. Settle in, wait me out, and eventually, either through my own accommodation or, implicitly, through the passage of time itself, simply absorb my house entirely into a life. She and Nolan had never once dishonesty with me. I did not confront her that evening. I simply retrieved the folder from my purse, checked, once again, that everything Foster had prepared was in order, and waited, with a patience I did not fully know I still possessed, to see exactly how far this pattern would ultimately extend before I needed to act on it decisively. I did not have to wait long. The Sunday this story turns on began, in every visible way, entirely ordinarily. I attended the 9 o'clock service at Grace Fellowship, as I had nearly every Sunday for over 3 decades. Sat in my usual pew alongside Patrice and several other longtime friends, and stayed afterward for the coffee hour that had become, in the years since Marvin's passing, one of the steadier social anchors of my week, I mentioned to Patrice. During that coffee hour, the phone conversation I'd overheard 4 days earlier, and watched her expression shift into something between vindication and genuine concern. Evelyn, that's exactly what I was worried about months ago. You need to act on this today if you can. I have the folder ready, I told her. I've had it ready for 6 weeks. I think I've just been waiting to see exactly how far they'd actually go before I used it. Well, Patrice said. I suspect you're about to find out. I drove home around noon, my purse, as always over the preceding 6 weeks, sitting on the passenger seat beside me, the folder tucked securely inside it. I pulled into my driveway. Noticed immediately that a small rental trailer, unfamiliar to me, was parked in front of the house, and felt a specific, cold certainty settle over me, even before I'd fully processed what I was seeing. I walked through my front door and understood immediately, from the sounds coming from upstairs, exactly what had happened during the 3 hours I had been at church. I climbed the stairs and found my own bedroom, the room Marvin and I had shared for 24 years before his passing, the room where I had slept alone for 7 years since. The room containing the bed we had chosen together on our 15th anniversary, the dresser that had been my own mother's before it was mine. Entirely transformed. My bed had been disassembled and moved into the hallway, propped against the wall in pieces, as though it were simply debris to be dealt with later. My dresser had been pushed into a corner, its drawers still partially open, clothes I had not yet had the chance to remove spilling out haphazardly. In its place stood an entirely different bedroom set. Brianna's furniture, larger, more modern, clearly measured and planned in advance for exactly this space, already fully assembled and arranged as though it had always belonged there. Brianna was standing in the middle of what had, 3 hours earlier, been my bedroom, directing Nolan as he carried in a final box, and both of them turned when they heard me in the doorway. "Oh, Evelyn, hi," Brianna said, with a brightness that struck me, in that moment, as almost surreal given what I was looking at. "So, we've been talking, and honestly, our room just doesn't get enough natural light, and this room is just so much bigger, and we figured, you're probably going to want to downsize eventually anyway, so we thought, why not just go ahead and set up properly now, get ahead of the whole thing? We can help you get resettled into our old room. It's actually really cozy." I stood in the doorway of my own bedroom, looking at my late husband's side of a bed, disassembled and shoved into a hallway like refuse, and I felt, in that specific moment, something I had not fully expected to feel after 6 weeks of careful, deliberate preparation. Not rage, exactly, though there was certainly anger present, but something closer to a clean, cold, almost peaceful clarity. I set my purse down on top of what remained of my own dresser, opened it, and removed the folder Foster had prepared 6 weeks earlier. "Nolan," I said, my voice steady in a way that seemed to surprise both of them. "Brianna, I need you both to sit down for a moment." "Mom, is everything okay?" Nolan asked, some genuine uncertainty finally entering his voice as he registered, perhaps for the first time, the actual gravity of what he was standing inside of. "I'd like to show you both something," I said, opening the folder and removing the first document. "This is the deed to this house. It has been in my name, solely, since your father and I purchased it 31 years ago. There is no ambiguity here whatsoever about who owns this property." I removed the second document. "This is a formal 30-day notice to vacate, prepared by my attorney 6 weeks ago, in the event I ever needed to use it. I am dating and serving it today." Brianna's face shifted through several rapid stages, confusion, then disbelief, then, as the reality of the documents fully registered, something closer to genuine alarm. "Mom, wait, this feels really extreme," Nolan said. "We were just trying to make the space work better. We didn't mean." "Nolan," I said, "I came home from church today to find my husband's side of our bed dismantled and left in a hallway, and another woman's furniture set up in the room I have slept in, alone, for 7 years since your father died. I want you to understand exactly what that looked like, walking in the door, to a woman who has spent 7 years grieving in that specific room. I have spent 6 weeks quietly gathering documentation because I suspected correctly that this arrangement had stopped being about temporary housing and had become, instead, exactly what I overheard Brianna describe to her mother 4 days ago on the phone, a strategy to simply wait me out until this house effectively became yours." The silence that followed lasted long enough that I could hear, faintly, the sound of the moving trailer's engine still idling outside. "You heard that?" Brianna finally said, her voice smaller now than I had heard it in the entire 8 months she'd lived under my roof. "I heard all of it," I said. "Eventually this just becomes our house. She's not getting any younger. I heard every word, Brianna, and I want you to understand that hearing it clarified something I had been too generous, for too many months, to fully let myself see clearly. It has been 5 months now since that Sunday afternoon, and I want to tell this part of the story honestly, because I believe it deserves an honest accounting. Nolan and Brianna moved out within the 30-day window the notice specified, into an apartment they secured, notably, within just under 2 weeks of that Sunday. A fact that told me something important about how genuinely constrained their housing search had actually been during the preceding 8 months, versus how comfortable the arrangement in my house had simply become for them once established. I did not restore my bedroom immediately. I want to be honest about the emotional weight that room carried for me even after Brianna's furniture had been removed and my own bed reassembled exactly as it had stood for over 2 decades. I spent several weeks sleeping in the guest room before I felt genuinely ready to return to the space Marvin and I had shared, working through, with the help of a grief counselor I began seeing during that period, feelings about that room and its violation that went considerably deeper than the practical matter of furniture being moved without permission. Nolan called me, roughly 3 weeks after the move out, in a conversation more honest than any we had shared in years. "Mom, I keep thinking about what it must have looked like, walking into that room. I don't think I ever let myself really picture it from your side, what it actually meant to you. Not just as a room, but as, I don't know, the last physical space that was still really about you and Dad. I was so focused on Brianna's frustration with our situation that I stopped really thinking about what any of this was actually costing you." "I appreciate you saying that," I told him honestly. "I think the harder question, Nolan, is why it took something this extreme for you to start really seeing it." He did not have a fully satisfying answer to that question, and I did not expect one. Some patterns, I have come to understand, take considerably longer to fully examine than a single difficult conversation allows for, and I have tried, in the month since, to hold space for that ongoing examination without either excusing what happened or refusing entirely to continue building a relationship with my son going forward. My relationship with Brianna, predictably, has not recovered in any meaningful sense. We have spoken only briefly, twice, both times centered entirely on logistics related to family gatherings that Nolan has continued, carefully, to try to arrange in ways that include both of us without requiring any deeper reconciliation. Neither of us, I think, genuinely wants to pursue. I finalized my restored bedroom 8 weeks after the incident, working with a designer Patrice recommended to help me thoughtfully update certain elements, new paint, a few new pieces alongside the furniture Marvin and I had chosen decades earlier, not to erase what had happened, but to reclaim the space fully and intentionally as my own, rather than simply restoring it to exactly what it had been before, as though the violation itself could be undone by returning everything to its precise original position. I am 60 years old. I built a life with a man I loved for 30 years, raised a son inside a home we made together, and then spent 8 months quietly watching that home slowly, deliberately be repositioned as something other than fully mine by 2 people who had, in their own words, calculated that time and patience would eventually simply hand it to them. People sometimes ask me if I regret how long I waited before finally acting. 6 weeks of carrying that folder in my purse, watching the pattern continue to develop, choosing to gather evidence rather than confronting things directly the moment I first felt uneasy. I tell them the truth, I do not regret the waiting, because I believe the patience I extended during those 6 weeks gave me something invaluable that immediate confrontation never would have: absolute, undeniable clarity, both for myself and eventually for Nolan and Brianna, about exactly what had actually been happening beneath the surface of an arrangement I had for too long allowed myself to interpret far more charitably than the evidence ultimately supported. I came home from church that Sunday to find my own bedroom disassembled and replaced without my knowledge or consent. I opened the folder in my purse, and within it was 6 weeks of quiet, deliberate preparation for exactly this moment. Proof, in the end, that the most powerful response to being underestimated is often not anger, but readiness.